There we go. Got it. All right, it has notified me. Great. So when we're talking the words depression and anxiety, we recognize that we hear those words quite a bit these days. We hear the word depression, we hear the words anxiety. Anxiety really more right now than depression, but we hear those words. And I think it's important for us to distinguish what are symptoms and what's a clinical diagnosis. Because a lot of times we will talk about symptoms as if they're a diagnosis. And what I mean by that is sometimes we will say someone is feeling anxious, right? And then confuse that with someone has an anxiety disorder. And there's a spectrum of that. As Dylan mentioned in her prayer, God created us and he created us with feelings, right? And we're going to have feelings all across the spectrum of things. There are going to be times where we feel depressed, right? We feel anxious. That doesn't mean we have a anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, right? And so I want us to sort of distinguish through that a little bit tonight, because again, we know that a range of emotion is normal, but there are sometimes that call for really big feelings, right? We can all conjure up in our minds a time where we felt really down and really sad, and there was something to be really down and sad about. There's times where we felt highly anxious, and it was right? There was certainly something to be anxious about. And so the goal is not about avoiding these types of feelings. And it's not about helping our children avoid these types of feelings, although sometimes I know we want to. It's about helping ourselves and our children regulate when those feelings come so that they don't become a bigger problem in the feeling in of themselves. When we think about anxiety in particular, I'm fascinated by how God designed us to respond in the face of fear, right? So we've all heard fight, flight, or freeze. And that is our God-designed response to danger, right? If there is a car coming straight at us, right, we want to have an immediate flight response from that. We want to get out of that danger. We don't want to have to stop and say, okay, that car is moving at this speed. And so we just want to get out of the way, right? And so that is how we stay safe, how we stay alive. Where anxiety becomes an issue often for us is two reasons, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but primarily when the danger that we're sensing isn't actually a danger. So we have anxiety about something that isn't actually something to be feared or concerned about. Or, are we good?
Hold on, yeah, there we go.
Okay. Or when our fear is out of proportion to the situation. So I've got a counselor friend who will say, we're imagining a grizzly bear coming at us, right? That's the level of fight, flight, or freeze that we're responding with, when really it's like a gummy bear. Right? It's not really a big deal. It's something easily managed, but we're imagining it's something really big. And we'll come back to that language in just a minute. So again, we're not talking about avoiding the emotions that we're going to be talking about. It's about how do we deal with them? How do we regulate them? And this is a huge gift that you can give your children. Now, I recognize it's hard to see your child suffer. It's hard for them to be upset about something. It's hard for them to have really uncomfortable and unpleasant feelings. And so our instinct is to protect them from those and situations that might invoke those. And to an extent, that's right? We're not going to, intentionally put children in the face of something that's going to cause them harm. But oftentimes we shield them from the emotions, not so much because those emotions are going to harm them. It's because it is hard for us to watch them experience them, instead of, hey, they're going to experience these feelings and emotions. And my job as a parent is to help teach them how to recognize them, how to name them, and how to deal with them, right? That's really the goal for you guys as parents. So let's get technical for a minute on when we use the word depression and we use the word anxiety, what do we actually mean? And I'm going to go technical as far as like clinically technical. So, Depression as a diagnosis, it's different than just sadness or even grief. Now, depression might be a part of grief, right? But depression is a clinical diagnosis. And again, we often say so-and-so is depressed when we really just mean they're kind of down in the dumps, or they're sad, or they're just really struggling with some discouragement. But when we talk about actual depression, the things that we need to be really concerned about as far as that might need treatment, we're talking about some pretty specific diagnostic criteria. And I've got a little version. This is for anybody, medical people or psychiatric people, this is called the DSM-5. So this is what we use to actually diagnose a depressive disorder. There's lots of controversy about how to diagnose and all that kind of good stuff, but I am going to list the symptoms that qualify somebody for a depressive disorder, because I think it will help you guys understand what it is that we're talking about. So when we're looking at depression, we're looking at 5 or more of the symptoms that I'm about to list over more than a 2-week period. So these are not just a couple of bad days. This is consistently seeing these things for more than a couple of weeks, more than 2 weeks. And it includes depressed or irritable, cranky mood, right? So a very important thing to recognize with children in particular is that a lot of times depression will show up as high levels of irritability, not necessarily sadness. So that's a nuance of childhood depression that a lot of times is missed, but there's an irritability, a high level of irritability with childhood depression. And that's going to go along with a loss of interest or pleasure in activities. Again, this is going to be a shift from the norm for that child. So they used to really enjoy soccer and art, and now they don't really care about it, right? That's different than, hey, my kid went through this phase where they were really into this, and now they're not really into this, they're into something else, right? This is just a total loss of interest or enjoyment in activities at all, particularly ones they used to enjoy. And then we're going to be looking at 3 or more of the following. So we're looking at maybe significant weight loss or a decrease in appetite. And again, this is not just, kids change in their eating habits over their development. When they're about to hit a growth spurt, they eat a lot. When they're not growing as much, they don't eat as much. So we're looking at something that would produce a weight loss, which obviously when we're talking about, all the way up through, teenage years, they should be gaining weight steadily. So if there's a decrease in that, that's something to be noticed. A major sleep disturbance. So they're all of a sudden unable to sleep, or they're unable to stay awake, right? They're sleeping way more than usual, or sleeping a lot less than usual, or unable to sleep. We're going to be looking at, fatigue or lack of energy. And so this is different than just, hey, we have been overscheduled for the past couple of weeks and been running ragged and we're all kind of weary. This is just a fatigue that is outside of the circumstance that you're noticing, hey, my kid shouldn't be this tired, right? There shouldn't be this level of lethargy with him or her. Feelings of guilt or worthlessness. So feeling guilty about things that aren't really their responsibility. Now, I know some kids just lean that way a little bit. They feel a little guilty and take responsibility for things that don't belong to them. So this would be something that would be a significant change, and that they would be pretty hard on themselves about. A decreased ability to concentrate. So you might notice that they're overly preoccupied, they're spacing out, they're not able to stay concentrating on normal tasks. Again, some kids, that is their baseline, have a hard time concentrating. This would be a change for that child, where normally they'd be able to concentrate on a variety of things, aren't able to any longer. In addition to those, some particulars for children and adolescents. Again, we said an irritable mood is something that, again, not everybody associates with depression in children in particular, but it's definitely can be present. The other is frequent, vague, or kind of non-specific physical complaints. So constantly having a stomach ache or a headache, or muscle aches or body aches that don't have a medical cause. It's also a symptom of anxiety, but it can definitely be a symptom of depression. Certainly for especially our older teenagers, if you find them self-medicating with things like alcohol or substances, right? They're needing to dull some of the emotions or feelings that they're feeling using alcohol or substances. And so this would be different than a kid who, is out and, misbehaving in a lot of ways, socially, but really needs that, feels like they need something to make themselves feel better. So that self-medicating piece. In teenagers, sometimes we'll see increased recklessness, right? Just kind of not caring about the consequences about things. And you'll see some increased kind of risk-taking behavior and recklessness. And all of these things, obviously, individually would be concerning. It's when we see things, in a group that we really start to take notice. And also looking at how much distress are these symptoms causing in the child, right? How much are they unable to go to school, engage in the family, do sports, hang out with their friends? So how much is that impairing their ability just to function in everyday life? And again, there are lots of symptoms, and so it's really takes a professional to really diagnose a depressive disorder using a lot of different instruments and scales and things like that. But the reason why I wanted to get technical is because I wanted you to kind of hear when we talk about depression, that's what we're talking about. And we'll talk about some different sad feelings in just a minute, but that's really what we mean when we're talking depression. So now anxiety. So again, anxiety is a word that we use a lot, and we use it a lot because we all have some level of it, right? In fact, a little bit of anxiety in some situations can actually be pretty helpful. It can motivate us to do things that we might not normally do. I talk with my teenagers in particular about anxiety related to school performance. And we generally agree that a little anxiety about how you do on a test actually helps them, because if they weren't worried or anxious about how they were going to do on a test, they probably wouldn't spend a whole lot of time studying on it, right? And so that's actually motivating, like that my fear or worry that I might not do well if I don't study actually motivates them to study. Now, there is a threshold in which anxiety becomes unhelpful, but a little bit of anxiety, right, helps us a little bit in certain circumstances. We know that anxiety is an energizing emotion. It's opposed to depression, which is a depressing emotion, right? We see mostly with depression a lot of fatigue, low kind of psychomotor activity, whereas anxiety produces a lot of energy. It produces a lot of energy both cognitively in our thinking, but also physically in our bodies. And so that's why you have people that are fidgeting constantly, right? Or unable to sit still and moving when they're anxious, because it's highly energizing emotion. And anxiety disorders, of which there are quite a few, there's not just one anxiety disorder, they really share features of just really excessive fear or anxiety, and then the related sort of behavioral factors or disturbances that come out of that fear. And there's really three primary ways in which anxiety manifests. It manifests in anticipatory anxiety, situational anxiety, and post-event processing anxiety. So you could probably figure out what each one means, but anticipatory anxiety is I'm anticipating an event, right? So I'm having anxiety before an event. And it might be that I'm anticipating what might happen in the event. It may also be that I'm anticipating how I might feel in an event. So the thing to be feared is either the situation or how I feel in that situation that might be highly distressing to me. And the second one is the situational anxiety. So in that moment, right, I'm feeling anxious. So I walk into classroom, sit down, and then my mind goes blank because I'm so anxious about this test, right, that I can't focus on the test. So in that moment, or I have stage fright, for example, I'll walk onto stage and forget all of my lines because I'm anxious about performance and fear of what might happen. Then the post-event processing anxiety is when somebody is replaying over and over again what's already happened. So that happens a lot with social anxiety, for example. So I may replay a conversation I had with a friend and maybe fearful that I hurt their feelings in some way. So I'm playing that over and over again. I have a high level of anxiety about how he or she might be feeling after that conversation. I'm having a hard time letting that go. And again, in that situation, I don't know if I've hurt their feelings or not. I'm just afraid I've hurt their feelings. And so I'm ruminating about that, something that's happened in the past. Now, those aren't mutually exclusive. You can have one or both or all three as far as how they present, but it is important to understand which one somebody is experiencing because how you'll handle those are a little bit different. And as I mentioned, there's lots of different types of anxiety disorders. Some major ones are your generalized anxiety disorder. That's going to be, I'm generally anxious most of the time. I can't really attribute it to one thing or another. I just feel anxious, either physically or the way that I'm thinking pretty consistently. There's obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder, which is also a pretty overused term, but really to break it down, the obsessive part is I've got these ruminating thoughts, these thoughts that circle around my head. Sometimes they're rational, sometimes they're irrational, but I have a really hard time letting them go. They're obsessive in quality. And so to get rid of them, there's some sort of compulsion, some sort of behavior that I'm doing to get rid of those. And so we most often associate like OCD type behaviors with like cleaning and things, right? But it can be a whole host of other types of things. Panic disorder, that's when your anxiety is heightened to a panic level, right? You hear people having panic attacks. You don't necessarily have to have panic attacks to have an anxiety disorder, or vice versa. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is an anxiety-related disorder. And so those two things are closely linked, and that's primarily because of our fight, flight, or freeze response gets activated in ways that's, again, seeing a bear in the room in that moment when the bear's actually not in the room, but it's something that's been triggered from the past. And then social phobia or social anxiety. So that's also something we're pretty familiar with, but we're anxious in social situations or relational type situations. We've got some fears related to that interaction. And then we also know that although anxiety and depression are very separate in how they present, anxiety at heightened levels over a period of time can certainly lead to depression. And the reason of that is that if you feel constantly consumed by, which often happens with anxiety, kind of that worst case scenario, that fear-based thinking, the world constantly feels scary, or these situations constantly feel scary, or I feel like I'm constantly having to confront these big things over and over again that are bringing up this anxiety, it can be depressing. It can lead to depression and feeling overwhelmed. We see that quite a bit in teenagers in particular, where anxiety over time can lead to that depression. Again, they don't have to coexist, but they often can. So that's the clinical technical piece. But out of those two things, out of depression, out of anxiety, what are some of the main concerns that we see resulting from either a diagnosis or just symptoms related to depression and anxiety? And really, I see three main buckets. There are many, but when I have somebody coming into my office, they're usually concerned about these three things. And that the first is distorted thinking or ruminating thoughts, like either the kiddo is saying, I can't stop thinking about this and I want to, or the parent is saying, hey, I want to help them know what is real, what's not real, what's distorted thinking. they're making this big deal out of something that I don't see as a big deal. How do I help them with that? So that would be the first thing. The second would be sleep and appetite disturbance, right? So when some of the basic functions that we know we need to stay and be healthy are starting to be disrupted. And the third one, which is really huge, is activity avoidance. So how do I not get into it as a parent? How do I not get into this power struggle with my kid about this? How do I know when to press, when to not press as a kid? Like, how do I know when I don't feel motivated to do something, when I actually just do it? Like, what do I need to do with that? So the first one, and I won't be able to answer probably all of your questions, but all three of these, but I'm going to try and hit the most frequently asked ones. So when we're talking about distorted thinking and ruminating thoughts, we're talking about this circular effect of I'm thinking something, which causes me to feel something, which causes me to think something, which causes me to feel something. And so we kind of go down this rabbit trail so that the longer we do it, the more distorted our thinking is. And it's because we're letting our feelings oftentimes dictate the way that we are feeling. And so that can be we all probably can relate to that. We've all been in that place where we just had a hard time turning our mind off and just letting it spin. And that usually doesn't come into a really good solution. It usually comes into feeling more overwhelmed by whatever it is that we're worried about or concerned about. Because our feelings, although we absolutely pay attention to them, but we look at them as information, because sometimes, or more often than sometimes not, our feelings can tell us things that aren't true. That's especially true with anxiety, because anxiety oftentimes will tell us that, like, the worst case scenario, the worst possible thing that could happen isn't just possible, that it's probable. The example I oftentimes will use with kids that makes them, and parents too, makes them really kind of understand this, is the anxiety that a parent feels when a kid is late for curfew, right? And so a kid's driving and they're late for curfew. The parent often, if they're thinking it from an anxious mind, or worried mind, a concerned mind, which all parents are concerned for their children, they're not thinking, oh, maybe they got stopped by the train, or maybe they left late from their friend's house or whatever. If my kid is late and I can't get them on the phone, where does my brain go, right? All kinds of worst case scenario places, right? And so the more we think about that, the more we let ourselves spin on that, the more probable that worst case scenario starts to feel, right? And that's oftentimes what's happening with in our kids' minds too, about that. The longer that circular thinking goes without it being interrupted in some way, right, can convince them that worst case scenario is not just possible, but probable. And that's when you start to hear things like, I know I'm going to, convinced I'm going to fail, convinced I can't, convinced that all these things are going to happen, when there's not a lot of basis in reality for what those things are. And so the skill that I really work hard to teach kids is really kind of putting on, works differently for different ages, but it works for all ages, really putting on sort of our investigator hat, right? Really stepping back and investigating the feelings that person, that the kid is feeling, and how that lines up with the facts, right? Like really letting them kind of investigate, hey, I get that this feeling feels really real to you. I get it. Let's take a step back and put our investigate. Let's put all in the column, all the evidence over here that thing actually is going to happen. All the evidence that thing is not actually going to happen. Like teaching them to kind of think critically about that, so that they're not letting their feelings drive the bus on that, and really helping them engage this part of their brain, their prefrontal cortex, which is not developed in a child and adolescent's brain. And so you as a parent really have to help cultivate that type of thinking. It's not going to be how they're naturally going to think. They're going to naturally think with their more emotional part of the brain, especially your teenagers in the room. Then looking at sleep and appetite disturbance, again, we've talked about you could have too much sleep you can have not enough sleep. You can have eating too much or not eating enough. And so what you want to be on your guard for is how much is sleep and food or appetite, how much of that is being used as a coping strategy, right? And so if restricting food or eating too much food or excessive amounts of food, if that's being utilized as a coping strategy, right, then that is something that will need to be paid attention to and addressed. Same thing with sleeping, right? If you find somebody is napping long hours of the day, you're going to want to investigate, is this because they really don't have enough energy to stay awake, or are they escaping from whatever it is that's going on during those waking hours? And really what you want to do with both sleep and appetite is you kind of want to get just back to basics, right? Like back to, when they were little kids, and say, okay, what do they need relative to sleep, right? What does their brain and body actually need? Same thing with nutrition, and really address those things pretty head on, because those things can get pretty out of control pretty quickly. And so that may mean taking them to the doctor and having them figure out why it is they're tired all the time and they're sleeping all the time, seeing if there's a medical reason, right? Addressing, that nutrition from a nutrition standpoint, and may not even be what it is they're eating or how much they're eating, right? But just making sure that they're getting the nutrition that they need in that, because we know that when our sleep and our diet get off, it can throw everything else out of kilter. And the last one, which is really the biggest one, I think, or the most opportunity for power struggle with parents and kids, I think, and that is activity avoidance. Anxiety and depression both are going to lend itself to activity avoidance, but for different reasons. So if you are feeling depressed, or you have if you have depression, you're going to lose interest. You're not going to have a lot of motivation. You're going to have that fatigue that we're going to talk about. It can feel too hard to engage in things, even things that are meant for fun, and even things that they used to enjoy. Anxiety is going to cause activity avoidance for a couple of different reasons. Like we talked about earlier, it's going to be because of maybe how they're going to feel during an event. Like, I'm fearful that I'm going to feel embarrassed. I'm fearful that I'm going to feel singled out. I'm fearful of something that I'm going to feel during the event. And then anxiety can also mean, it could also happen when I'm afraid of something that will happen during an event. It's really important that you ask the differences between that with anxiety, because that will help you understand if there is actually something to be afraid of. Because anxiety, again, is a warning sign. Fear is a warning sign for us. And so you will want to, as a parent, know that, oh, there isn't actually anything unsafe happening. They just see it as unsafe, versus, oh, there's something unsafe happening. And that's actually and my child's fight or flight response is actually responding appropriately to something that's not okay that I need to address. And so those are kind of things that you're going to want to be looking at as you're having conversations about activities when kids don't want to go to different things, and the reasons why. And, it's really important also for both depression and anxiety that we don't allow our kids to disengage completely from activity. Our tendency is to, it's, so distressing for them to go to school, right? They have such terrible school anxiety. It's just too hard to push that issue. But we know that avoiding school, if we're anxious about it, actually doesn't make the anxiety better. It does in that moment, solves the momentary problem, doesn't solve the long-term problem, right? It's just saves the problem for another day. Same thing with depression. When I feel like it's too hard to go to school, yes, and I don't make them, then yes, it solves today's problem, but it doesn't solve the real problem. And so what you want to do in that regard is have some intentional conversations as a family about, okay, what's reasonable in this moment? Yes, we know you're struggling with feeling really down and depressed and everything still feels really hard. Let's talk about what are the things that you actually really have to do, and what are some things that we can actually maybe put on pause while you're healing, while you're dealing with what you're dealing with that feels like too much right now. So we want to recognize that if somebody is dealing with depression or dealing with significant anxiety, things are much more difficult. So they may not be able to operate at the same level that they're used to operating with, but also recognizing that we're not going to fully disengage completely from whatever it is that might feel anxious. Kids struggle with this a lot of times because they see, well, if my parents only understood how hard it was for me, then they wouldn't make me do that, right? And so you want to communicate for sure, hey, I get that this is hard and we're going to do it anyway, so let's figure out how we can do it together. So you want to communicate again that you're with the child, but also there's some things that are just non-negotiable. Getting up and going to school, kind of non-negotiable, right? And there are other families' priorities that might be non-negotiable in your family that you'll have to figure out kind of as a family what that looks like. All right, so I'll give you all a couple of resources, and I'm going to email these to Dylan so she can send them out to you guys, and then we'll do questions. So one of my favorite websites, and you guys may already well know this, so maybe give me all resource that is not actually a resource because you already know, and that is the Raising Boys and Girls website. There's a ton of fantastic material out there for parents and for kids. I think there's like 12 or 15 different books on that. There's specifically for girls, there's some really great resources for middle school, elementary and middle school girls, which I think they don't have the same corresponding materials for boys, which I think is really a shame, but they're out there for the girls. And then there's a ton of parenting resources out there for depression and anxiety, as well as a variety of other types of things. And then a book that I really love about how to understand kids and help regulate emotions and feelings is The Whole Brain Child by Siegel. It's another great one of just, again, if you want to know how to help your kid regulate their emotions, it's a good one because like we said in the very beginning, it's not about avoiding the feelings and avoiding the emotions. It's about how we can teach our kiddos how to deal with those feelings when they come. All right, Dylan, I'm ready for questions, whatever everybody's got me.
Anybody have any questions? I know, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I know I have two daughters with anxiety, one pretty crippling. And so when, I know there's things that I probably missed when they were younger. So what is a good way to kind of notice those things early so that they don't start getting out of control when you actually start noticing them as a teenager?
Yeah, so a couple of things on that. One, so when teenagers start to their bodies start to change and hormones start to change and all of that, it's actually when a lot of anxiety disorders, if they're going to present themselves, or depression is going to start to manifest. So there's some things that you can look for, right, in some kind of how somebody is wired that can kind of predict that kind of thing. And there's some things that just are going to develop at that age, whether you notice signs before or not. So I think it's just critical to always just be in tune with your kid and noticing, hey, there's a shift here for my child. I noticed my child consistently has been doing this, and now I'm noticing a little something different. Or I'm noticing that the way my child is handling this particular situation is pretty different than how his or her friends are handling that. And that doesn't mean different, bad or wrong, but just noticing that about your kid. And then I think it's really having intentional conversations with your kid, all the way, teaching them the language, the vocabulary about their bodies and how feelings can sometimes show up in their bodies, because a lot of times kids will be able to communicate a feeling in their body before they're able to name an emotion. And so if you're having those kind of conversations like, hey, I noticed, that, tell me how, when you were having that, fight with your brother, right? Tell me where you were feeling that in your body, right? And so you're teaching them what to notice, and then you're learning more and giving them some language to their emotions. So I think that's probably the most important thing from a very early age, whether or not they have anxiety or depression or not, you're just teaching them to notice how they're feeling. And then you're giving them some, again, language to know how to express that. And you're also communicating that you're seeing them and you're noticing what's going on with them. And so they're opening up those avenues for conversation if they do have some feelings and things that they're really struggling with, and they don't know, you want them to be able to talk to you about those.
Laurin, we're all kind of living in this world of COVID, and our kids are, activities are canceled, and then you're in quarantining. So what are your advice that you're giving to parents, to cope through that and help them through, not taking that stress on themselves, or, all of those things?
Yes. Yeah. So I think in COVID, all of us, but particularly our kids, have had to deal with the feeling of disappointment in such huge ways, and in ways that are, frankly, is pretty heartbreaking for our kids and for you guys as parents, as you're watching your kid be disappointed over and over and over again. And so I think the big thing on that is to name that, like recognizing this is a big deal for them, right? Naming that this is disappointing, and I'm sad, and I'm frustrated, and I wish it were different, and really just connecting with them in that, because as much as we would like to, we can't fix it, right? And we can't. I wish I had the magic wand that would fix it all, but I think it's helping them know that it's okay to talk about that disappointment, and it's okay to talk about that frustration, and not again, just not trying to fix it because we can't. And so I think that would be one thing. I think the other thing that I am seeing right now in particular, so anxiety has been highly prevalent through all of COVID. One of the things I'm seeing in particular right now, especially with families, is this heightened pressure to do all of the things, right? To try and make up for all of the lost time that we lost, that our kids lost, all of these experiences, opportunities, things that they missed. And so while that makes all the sense in the world, because you want such good things for your kids and you want them to have all of those opportunities and experiences, what it's doing is it's creating a great deal of stress and a great deal of anxiety, because a lot of kids are feeling like they have to do all the things right now, and they're exhausted, and they're feeling that pressure to kind of make up for lost time, even though they wouldn't necessarily say that. And then I think what's really critical is socially, developmentally and socially, many of our kids are about a year and a half behind, right? They haven't had typical social interactions, scenarios, hallmarks, and things like that for a year and a half or so. And so we're seeing this quite a bit in schools. So like I'll talk often, in fact, I had a gal in my office yesterday who was a junior in high school. And we were talking about how she's expected, and rightfully so, because she's a junior, to do junior level things, junior level study skills, junior level activities, junior level social interactions, academics, all of those things, with really a ninth grade level kind of muscle memory, right? Because she hasn't had all the opportunities that a typical junior would have, right? She actually has the same level of high school experience, in-person experience based on this kid's school as a ninth grader. as the ninth graders in her building. And so I think we have to also take that into account with our kids when we're kind of jumping back into things that, yes, we want really good things, but we may also need to kind of take a step back and recognize we may actually be stressing our kids out by trying to give them all the good things.
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay.
I have two children, a daughter who's 11 and a son who is 7, so 4-year age difference. My daughter suffered from anxiety for many years, especially around school. And now my son sometimes emulates the behavior, mostly because he's seen it. So sometimes we have a hard time differentiating between real anxiety versus this is just what he's grown up seeing, and this is how we function as a family in the morning sometimes. How do we handle those feelings and validate them, but also not give them a lot of power?
Great way of doing that. And I think it starts with a conversation of, helping your kid recognize that they have some control in how much power they're giving their own feelings. And so one of the things I love about the one of Sissy Goff's books, I get the order wrong. Braver, smarter, stronger. I get the order. It's those 3 words, but I get the order wrong all the time. But talks a lot about how to separate themselves from their anxiety and have it be something else other than themselves that doesn't have control over them. So that would be the first thing is, teaching that we aren't our anxiety, right? That is not necessarily synonymous with us. And then I just think it's just teaching good self-regulation skills all the way around, right? That good breathing, that good fact over feeling like, okay, yeah, you feel this feeling, and you can get a debate about whether he's feeling it or not feeling it. But hey, this feeling, this behavior is presenting itself. Here's how we handle that when that happens, right? As a family, we take that head on. We don't avoid what we're worried about. We confront what we're worried about. We do some good deep breathing. We talk about it. All those different skills that are just good life skills, for a kiddo. But yeah, that can often happen when you've got a younger sibling modeling an older sibling's behavior. And oftentimes it's because that behavior that an older sibling is demonstrating gets a lot of attention, right? If you have a highly anxious child, it demands a lot of attention, right? A lot of management, right? And so you want to make sure, again, that that you're addressing the issue, head on, regardless of really how it's presenting.
I don't think anybody else has any questions, but thank you so much. And
Sure.
I think you've given us a lot to think about, and it didn't sound super scary. So we will if you'll send me those links, I'll get those out, and anything else that you think of that could be a good resource.
Absolutely. If there's anything follow up, I'm happy to send that too. So y'all just let me know.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan.